This is happening now. You're watching live footage from the Japanese city of Osaka. Chinese President Xi Jinping is meeting US President Donald Trump on the sidelines of this year's G20 summit.
One basic fact remains unchanged. China and United States both benefit from cooperation and lose in a confrontation. Cooperation and dialogue are better than friction and confrontation. Recently, Mr. President, you and I have stayed in close communication through phone calls and exchange of letters. Today, I'm prepared to exchange views with you on the fundamental issues concerning the growth of China-US relations, so as to set the direction for our relationship in the period to come and to advance the China-US relationship based on coordination, cooperation, and stability.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We have had a lot of time together, and we've become friends. My trip to Beijing with my family was one of the most incredible of my life. I've seen a culture that rarely would you see. Chinese culture is an incredible culture. I look forward to working with you. As you know, we've had an excellent relationship, but we want to do something that will even it up with respect to trade. I think it's something that's actually very easy to do. I actually think that we were very close, and then something happened where it slipped a little bit, and now we're getting a little bit closer, but it would be historic if we could do a fair trade deal. We're totally open to it, and I know you're totally open to it. I know all of your representatives. I've been working very hard with my representatives and the representatives of the United States, and I will say that I think this can be a very productive meeting, and I think we can go on to do something that truly will be monumental and great for both countries, and that's what I look forward to doing. And thank you very much for hosting us. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
So that is underway, the meeting between Chinese President Xi Jinping and his US counterpart Donald Trump in the Japanese city of Osaka on the sidelines of this year's G20 summit. Both leaders have just delivered a brief opening remarks to the meeting, and now it officially starts. Of course, CGTN will keep you updated on this crucial meeting between the leaders of the world's two largest economies. So the G20 summit this year underway in Osaka has drawn global attentions. One of the reasons for this is, as we just mentioned, Chinese President Xi Jinping's meeting with his US counterpart Donald Trump amid current trade tensions between the world's two largest economies. Now let's take a look at the relationship between the two countries' current heads of state to find out what are the impacts they have made on the bilateral ties.
The friendship began at Mar-a-Lago on April 6, 2017, when Chinese President Xi Jinping met with his US counterpart Donald Trump at the private golf club that's come to be known as the Southern White House, a more relaxed atmosphere than the formal setting of Washington. A new starting point, that's what Chinese President Xi Jinping called this tete-a-tete. The two sides agreed to establish 4 high-level dialogue mechanisms aimed at enhancing communication and cooperation in the fields of diplomacy, the economy, cybersecurity, and social and cultural exchanges. 3 months later, the two leaders met once again at the 12th G20 summit in Hamburg, and once again cooperation remained at the top of their agenda.
Strengthening the cooperation between China and the U.S. benefits world peace and prosperity. It is also in the interest of people in China, the United States, and around the world.
On November 8, 2017, the U.S. president began his first state visit to Beijing by touring the iconic Forbidden City. The Chinese president, serving as his personal guide, gave Trump a lesson in China's long history and culture. Both of the two leaders were looking to make history.
We need to further expand trade and investment cooperation. strengthen macroeconomic policy cooperation, and proceed to healthy, stable, and dynamically balanced economic and trade relations.
Nothing you can see is so beautiful. I just want to thank you for the very warm welcome, and I look forward to many years of success and friendship.
But even at this summit, the dark clouds of the coming trade war were already starting to gather.
Trade between China and the United States has not been, over the last many years, a very fair one for us.
Only 2 months later, the Trump administration took the first shot. Washington imposed import tariffs on Chinese solar cells and washing machines in January of 2018. Other tariffs on steel and aluminum quickly followed. Beijing retaliated against the move with duties on about $3 billion worth of U.S. goods. The two presidents hadn't met throughout the year of 2018 until the 13th G20 summit in Argentina. Although Xi and Trump agreed at a working dinner to strike a truce deal within 90 days, the flames of the trade war still raged into 2019. This May, the White House said the tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese goods would increase to 25%, despite repeated claims by the government that trade talks with Beijing were going well.
We have a meeting set up with President Xi, and it's obviously on the big transaction that we're talking about and negotiating. Our people are actually speaking now. We'll see what happens with that.
The world's two largest economies are in a tug-of-war. The questions of whether the two leaders will meet or not has been posed repeatedly to China's foreign ministry. Senior diplomats have said the two presidents certainly intend to have a sit-down, but whether it happens and what the pair will discuss remains anyone's guess. Yu Yang, CGTN.
Again, this is happening now. Chinese President Xi Jinping is meeting his U.S. counterpart Donald Trump in the Japanese of Osaka. About 5 minutes ago, the two leaders have just delivered opening remarks to their meeting, and now the meeting is underway. Now, for more insight into this crucial meeting between the world's two largest economies, we're joined in the studio by Mr. Zhao Hai from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. So, Mr. Zhao, let's start with the two leaders' opening remarks. Chinese President Xi Jinping made it very clear that China and the US will benefit from cooperation, and both will be hurt by confrontation, whether in any form. Now, this is a very sincere stance. Do you think the United States is expressing the same stance in the process of trade talks?
I think so.
You think the United States is sincere?
At this point, I think whether or not that's under the pressure or sincerely from the bottom of the heart of President Trump, it doesn't matter, because they have to sit down and negotiate with China. From what happened in the past year and a half, since the start of this trade war, both sides have sacrificed because of the trade confrontation and escalation. The world also suffered because of this. We've known that IMF, World Bank, all the global institutions lowered the economic expectations for this year. So I think this is not a simply statement put out from Chinese side. I think on the G20 platform, leaders from the globe actually agree with President Xi that this continuation of the trade war will harm global economy, not simply between China and the US, but all the other countries, because we're now in a globalized period. And countries are linked with global supply chain. And once you wreck one link, all the other links start to shake. So I think it's important to reestablish that link.
Again, I have to ask you, do you think the Trump administration is getting this message you just mentioned? Because, you know, professionals would understand it easily. Yeah. But the U.S. leadership thinks tariffs are a viable source of revenue, which it is not. It's a consumption tax on U.S. companies and U.S. consumers. And talking about current situation, the United States is still threatening up to $300 billion US Chinese goods to additional tariffs. So how do you think the talks or the negotiations will move forward if there will be any advancement?
Well, my personal opinion is that when you put personal belief against the law of the economics, the law will win every time. So in the short period, in a very short period, when President Trump escalates the war by imposing more and more tariff, maybe the resistance is not there. However, from the latest hearing in the USTR, we've seen 96% of the companies actually came out and say tariffs is the wrong way to address these problems. So even though Trump still wants to go about this way, and the hawks in his administration wanted to continue this way of pressuring China, but I don't think this is a viable way, and it's going to wreck the economy in both countries and globally continuously, I think, if they continue to adopt this kind of method. So again, maybe they think that tariff is a viable tool to push China, but China has already expressed that China will not bend under this pressure, and this will not work in the long run.
So having said that, are you implying that this could be a lasting issue, at least for the near future, between the two countries?
Yeah, I think this is it cannot be resolved overnight. These are very complex issues, complicated relations between the two countries. They need to figure out the way moving forward gradually and try to find common ground and enhance mutual trust. So simply focusing on the division between the two countries right now, very much by the hawkish people in the Trump administration, it's, I think, a temporary thing. Over a long period of time, gradually people will realize that the two countries need to build a constructive and stable relationship. Otherwise, the world will suffer. So
what do you think is the common ground for both countries in this current stage of talks, if there would be any? Looking at what the United States has been doing against the Chinese technology firms, do you think there is any common ground solely regard to trade?
Well, the thing is, if you look at G20, the common ground is actually on the global stage. Right now, the U.S. side focus too much on bilateral relationship. That's actually President Trump's favorite method against other countries. However, if you look at the global stage, there are many common challenges we both face, and all the other countries, like climate change, like counterterrorism, all the other issues, geopolitical tensions. So in order to solve those issues, China and the U.S. need to work together, and many people have pointed that out. So I think only focusing on division will only escalate the tensions and making other potential cooperations impossible. So at this stage, I think President Trump, hopefully in the next hour, will be persuaded by President Xi that they need to work on many more cooperative grounds instead of just focusing on a very narrowly defined trade disputes.
So let's talk about bilateral ties a little bit more. In his opening remarks, President Donald Trump said, and I'm quoting, the two countries' relationship slipped a little bit. Do you think it's a little bit, or this is really a serious issue, not only about technology, trade, but also about very political trust, and how the United States sees China as a stakeholder, as a rivalry, or as a competitor?
I think from the official statement from the U.S., China is now an official competitor to the U.S. And to a certain extent, the U.S. called China revisionist to the current global system. However, I think in many ways, China sees this bilateral relationship, particularly economic relationship, as a ballast of this stable relationship, and that now is in danger. That's why I think from the Chinese side, this is not a light matter. But from President Trump, because U.S. is still world dominant power, he says U.S.-China relationship is just one of many relationships, even though it's one of the most important. So I think Trump, at this stage, trying to make these things lighter than it should be, and so that they can make progress in order to overcome some of the difficulties. So probably this is a tactic that he's employing before the summit. And hopefully when there's some concessions he can make to the Chinese side, then they can reach a deal and he can convince back home that this is the right approach to take.
And Mr. Zhao, let's get more U.S. perspective, and let's talk to Paulo van Schirach, president of the Global Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Schirach. So let's continue our discussion on the possibility to find a common ground at this stage between China and the United States. Let's start with the U.S. side. How much pressure President Donald Trump is faced, because we know that the re-election is coming up and he thinks tariffs are a source of revenue, which it is not. And he's facing mounting pressure from US companies, US consumers, saying that all your tariffs are paid by our US and American citizens.
Indeed, well, that is true. And there is certainly a certain visible pressure coming from a variety of voices in the U.S., in particular the voice of business. I name one, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. My office, by the way, is just 2 blocks away from them, so I see them all the time. And they are certainly vocal in saying, hey, this is really hurting us. This is hurting our members, which are companies, and down the line is hurting consumers. All the millions of Americans who shop at Walmart and Target buy, to a large extent, Chinese made in China goods. And to the extent that there are going to be substantially higher tariffs, these consumers will be hurt because prices will go up. That said, I should point out that there is a very broad political agreement in Washington, which now includes the Democratic Party, the opposition party, which in general agrees about on nothing with this president. But there seems to be considerable agreement on keeping the pressure on China. So here we are frankly going beyond the issue of a trade war, of tariffs, and who buys what from whom and in what amounts, and if that can be rebalanced in a way that is satisfactory to both parties. There is a concern, whether it's justified or not, there is a growing concern in the United States, and as I said, this includes both political parties in Washington, that China is not playing fair. That seems to be the real concern. Now, obviously the Chinese side disagrees on this, but here is the point of contention. It's not so much about the trade imbalance, which is clearly part of the problem and indeed what triggered the current predicament, but there is the perception, right or wrong, that China is trying to manipulate the global rules of trade and how business should be conducted across the board, and that the Chinese and the tariffs imposed by Trump are viewed from this perspective as a way to pressure China to change its behavior. This seems to be the real problem. And I think.
Do you think actually that's the real problem? Because looking at what the Trump administration has done to Chinese companies like Huawei, do you think it's only thinking about China's behavior in trade, or do you think it's something more? They want to, take China back to the old days as a world factory rather than an advancing global leader in technological advancement?
Indeed. Look, as I said, I'm just telling you what I see. I am not suggesting that this approach is correct. I'm just saying what I see is that there is a broad political consensus in Washington, which now clearly unites the Republican Party and the Democratic Party in opposition, which agree on almost nothing else, that there is a problem with China. This seems to be the new consensus emerging in Washington. Whether this is about America feeling the pressure, and of course there is a rising economic power, and that is China, and that is growing and developing itself and in making investments in innovation, in new technologies and in ICT and all these great things that China is doing. The contention in Washington is that this is not done according to the established rules of the game. That's what's happening here. And whether this is the result of a profound misunderstanding or it is just some kind of a disguise on the part of the United States to try to preserve old entrenched leadership positions which are seen to be threatened by a rising China, well, that's a matter of judgment and interpretation. But I think personally, looking at the evolving scene here, that this is really what's at stake. And I really hope that the two leaders who are meeting just as we speak here may be able to clear the air between the two of them and say, hey, let's see what's really going on here. It's not just about the trade imbalance, but about all these other things. How can we convince each other that we are both playing fair and that nobody's trying to outdo the other using, untoward means. And I know this is extremely complicated, but I really hope that the two leaders, talking as they are right now, can set a new tone for the conversation. Because if this view remains entrenched from the standpoint of the United States, I am not very optimistic about the possibility of a far-reaching deal that will clear the air and set a new tone and new modalities for an ongoing, stable and productive relationship.
So, Mr. Schrock, talking about clearing the air, let's talk about President Donald Trump's campaign promise to bring back manufacturing capability back into the United States. And he also blames the hollowing out of the US manufacturing on China. But looking at the latest reports coming from the United States, Apple is actually thinking about moving its last remaining production line in the United States to China. And looking at the size of the US financial sector, do you think that is actually realistic, and do you think China should take the blame?
No, I think, look, you're touching a very good point here. What Mr. Trump promised back in 2016 when he was running for president, frankly, was a fantasy. There have been certain dramatic and fundamental changes in the makeup of the U.S. economy, and certainly, while, by the way, as you know, the American economy is growing. The last quarter, the United States economy grew more than 3%, which by our standards is pretty high, considering that it used to be 2%. Unemployment is an all-time low, and so real wages are going up. So things are going pretty well regarding the overall U.S. economy. However, about the possibility of regaining lost manufacturing jobs, and by the way, Mr. Trump doesn't just blame China on this. He blames Mexico, he blames Europe, he blames Japan, he blames everybody. So this is not just about China. Of course, China is our biggest partner, and so maybe it gets a bigger share of the blame. But essentially, there's this idea that these losses are due to some kind of unfair practices and untoward behavior. I don't really think that it is realistic to think that it's possible. Well, some manufacturing jobs may come back to the United States, or new ones may be generated in new sectors. But the idea that America will go back to what it used to be, say, in the 1980s or even 1990s is a fantasy. That's never going to happen. It's impossible, simply because certain basic transformations have already taken place, and therefore you don't walk these things back. So that, to me, it's a non-issue. And I really hope, again, that we can move beyond this kind of rhetoric, which, politically speaking, of course, was struck a chord in America because Mr. Trump's political support at the time of the 2016 election, and maybe he's trying to play the same card now that he's running for re-election, are precisely the areas of the United States, mostly geographically in the Midwest, which have been hit the hardest by globalization and by this reshuffling of production and distribution and global supply chains. In other words, the manufacturing hubs in Michigan or Wisconsin or Minnesota or Pennsylvania or other such states are those that were hurt by globalization, as it played out in the United States. But the idea that this is doable, I just don't think this is going to work. It hasn't worked really in this time that Mr. Trump has been president, and I don't really think that he can do any better now, even with this, especially with this go tough approach on China. I don't see how that is going to benefit U.S. manufacturing at all.
Thank you very much, Mr. Paulo von Strack in Washington, D.C. Now, as we speak, Chinese President Xi Jinping is meeting U.S. President Donald Trump in the Japanese city of Osaka. And for the latest, let's cross live to our reporter Zheng Yibing in Osaka. Hello, Yibing. So the crucial meeting is underway. What momentum you've been gathered in the city?
Well, yes, Pandang. Well, the meeting is still ongoing, and for the time being, this section is closed door, and we're looking for the good results from both leaders. As we are very impressed by the opening remark by Chinese President Xi Jinping by saying both countries shared a very long history, of good friendship, and China is ready to have the very good talk with U.S. side, and also U.S. President Trump also said is open for historic talk with China for this trade deal. And actually, this is the first China-U.S. leaders meeting in 7 months. And the following topics they would cover include the dispute over Huawei technologies and trade, among other topics. We will bring more details on that later. And early this morning, President Trump said he and President Xi had seen each other on Friday evening at a dinner of a group of 20 leaders. He said a lot was accomplished actually last night, and he stressed the bilateral ties with China. But as whether or not both sides can make a deal, he said the time will tell. Several G20 leaders warned on the first day of the summit on Friday that growing Sino-U.S. trade friction was threatening global growth. And EU leaders, and he also told the Europe news conference on Friday that the trade relations between China and United States are difficult. They're contributing to the slowdown of the global economy. And also on Friday, the White House said the best outcome from the talks would be the resumption of trade negotiations. Now, everybody's looking for the good result of the meeting, whether or not it would achieve big results. Back to you, Han Deng.
Thank you very much, our reporter Zheng Yibing in the Japanese city of Osaka. So, Mr. Zhao, let's talk more about the ongoing meeting between US President Donald Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping. Let's talk more about China's stance. China is willing to talk with sincerity, but the foreign ministry made it very clear before the G20 summit began that China would not bow down to any extortion or threat. What do you make of this stance?
I think I want to talk about the previous speaker's point,
Yeah,
which
sure.
is somehow the U.S. Has a consensus between the two parties and actually among elites in the U.S. complaining about China's unfair trade practices. There are certain complaints. For instance, there's joint statements from the U.S., EU, and Japan talking about certain trade relations practices from other countries, the third country, which probably imply China. So actually, China is moving towards more opening up and reform. And China's step has been steady on its own rhythm. But the problem is the US side and many other countries believing that it's too slow, and they wanted to see specific opening up, widening doors from the Chinese side. So I think fundamentally it's not about whether or not China's moving backwards or China's refusing to open up more of its market, but the steps that has been taken and the timing of the steps been taken. So I think gradually, if that's the case, then we will have a common ground. We can negotiate, find each other halfway through, and then try to make a deal. But the problem, as you pointed out, if that's about repressing China from developing onto a higher ladder of the value chain, then that's a different story. If the U.S. trying to stop China's development, particularly enlarging its roles in high tech, I think that's what China cannot accept. China's position from the very beginning is very clear, that what we can do, we will do, and what we cannot accept, we will not accept. Even though you have more pressure on us, we will not accept that, we will stand firm. So I think this position has been very consistent from the very beginning, and if there's any misunderstanding from the US side or others, that's their mistake.
Talking about misunderstanding, let me follow up on your earlier remarks. You said the United States and some Western countries are pushing for a greater level of opening up of China, but that kind of opening up is totally different to China's on a roadmap of opening up, because let's face it, for past several decades, Western countries have been promoting this neoliberalism ideas all around the country, causing many financial and economic disasters. And do you think they really want to put this idea into China?
I think there are two problems. As you said, the globalization is not benefiting everybody in Western countries. For instance, in the US, the rising populism is because of the distribution of the wealth gained from globalization are not evenly distributed between the rich and the poor. And actually, if you look at US manufacturing, it's actually growing in value. But however, the employment is declining because of the automation and because of other issues that is not related directly to U.S.-China trade. So now they're trying to blame China on their domestic problems, some of those at least. And also, the other thing is that the U.S. companies are facing fierce competition from the rising Chinese domestic firms and EU and other countries. So they're trying to blame China for their facing more competition from other side, reduced profitability in China instead of enhancing their compatibility, but blaming China, for instance, like IPR theft or other issues. Of course, there are problems on the Chinese side. We're improving that. We have more protection for IPR now, and it's going to have better protections. As President Xi Jinping pointed out just yesterday, we'll have criminal and civil prosecutions for any violation of IPR in the future. We have established a new court to govern that area. So I think overall, China is moving to the right direction. It's about whether or not the U.S. can accept China's sovereignty and China's own self-promoted opening up and reform, and that's the key problem.
And Mr. Dao, now let's hear more remarks from Chinese President Xi Jinping before his meeting with US President Donald Trump in the Japanese city of Osaka. Take a listen.
48 years ago, in 1971, in a place called Nagoya, just over 100 kilometers from here, Chinese and American ping pong players participating in the 31st World Table Tennis Championships had friendly interactions with each other. And that marked the beginning of what we now call ping pong diplomacy. The small ball played a big role in moving world events.
So in his remarks, President Xi Jinping mentioned a very significant event in the history of China-US ties. Actually, before China and the US established formal diplomatic ties, the ping-pong diplomacy in 1971. Now, that was before formal diplomatic ties.
Yeah.
Today, what can we learn from that kind of interaction 4 decades ago?
Yeah, this year is the 40th anniversary of U.S.-China normalization of diplomatic relations, and even 8 years before that normalization, U.S. and China started to contact with each other through ping pong diplomacy, as you mentioned. That means even in the most difficult times, U.S. and China can find a way to talk to each other, communicate with each other, and try to find common ground and improve relations. So even though that takes 8 long years to finally establish normalized diplomatic relationship, still through that process, U.S. and China understand each other more deeply, and we have people-to-people exchanges during that time, and that contributed to the later more prosperous and stable U.S.-China relations. So I think President Xi at this time citing ping-pong diplomacy to President Trump means that we need a new start of U.S.-China relationship. We're entering into a new era. This relationship needs to be redefined. However, this shouldn't be a conflictory relationship. This need not to be a very adversarial relationship between the two sides.
And as you just mentioned, the relatively softer side of diplomacy can play sometimes a bigger role in building trust between two countries. But looking at what the United States has been doing recently, its policies against Chinese scholars, the FBI issues notice, warnings to US universities against the Chinese scholars. What's at play here from the US side?
I think the US side, particularly the Department of Justice, they established the China Initiative, trying to impose on the Chinese scholars doing research on the U.S. and also scholars participating in any high tech in the U.S., trying to stop and cut the links between the U.S. and China. That's the wrong way to go. And actually, within the U.S., universities, many universities now having public statements saying that that is the wrong approach. So I think not only from the Chinese side, but also within the U.S., there are people who understand the importance of this bilateral relationship.
That's exactly right, because education is part of the U.S. service export, if you will, to China, and it's making huge profit. Now, talking about trade, let's hear more from Chinese President Xi Jinping's remarks in Osaka.
But one basic fact remains unchanged. China and the United States both benefit from cooperation and lose in a confrontation. Cooperation and dialogue are better than friction and confrontation. Recently, Mr. President, you and I have stayed in close communication through phone calls and exchange of letters. Today I'm prepared to exchange views with you on the fundamental issues concerning the growth of China-US relations, so as to set the direction for our relationship in the period to come and to advance the China-US relationship based on coordination, cooperation, and stability.
So, Mr. Again, we have to emphasize this very basic fact that, according to President Xi Jinping, remains unchanged. China and the US will benefit from cooperation and both will lose from confrontation. And President Xi Jinping also mentioned the new direction of the growth of China-US ties. How difficult would that be at this stage? And what role can the relationship between the two presidents play in this bid?
First of all, let's look back. For the past 30, 40 years, both China and the US gained tremendously from tightening relationship between the two. Particularly after China entered into WTO, China's per capita GDP grew dramatically to close to $10,000 and the US actually rise from back 30 years ago from 10,000 to now close to 60,000. So I think both countries gain a lot, and the US cannot say that they have been taken advantage of and not gaining from this very important bilateral relationship. However, at this point, because of the complaints from different sector of the US, moving forward is very difficult, particularly after Trump administration taking office. There are people in his administration are very hawkish against China.
Exactly. Looking at the lineup of today's delegation, Mike Pompeo is there, John Bolton is there, China hawks.
Yeah, absolutely. And these people, as long as these people occupy those seats and they're having this very hardline foreign policy, economic policy against China, it's for me it's very difficult to reach a real, wholeheartedly executionable kind of deal between the two countries. But the other side of the thing is, if we can persuade the most hard people in the U.S. to trust that China is moving towards more opening up and reform, and we can work together with those most conservative people, then it's better to work with other people in the American society. So at this point, I think we have to try at least before they shut the door, and if they shut the door, we have to fight back.
So tell us a little bit more about China's adjustment in its trade structure with the whole world, because we just mentioned all those difficult elements from the US side causing a blow to China-US bilateral trade. What's China's policies and strategies right now?
China's policy is very clear. China will open up the door even wider to welcome foreign investment, to welcome foreign goods, and China will yesterday, I think the day before, China has a new forum between China and Africa, accepting, welcoming more African goods coming in. And now China is negotiating at the same time bilateral and multilateral trade deals and investment deals with Europe, with Japan, with Japan and Korea, and also RCEP, and possibly even CPTPP. So I think in many, many ways, China's answer to the world is that China wants to play a leading role in more globalization, more free trade, and stabilize this global trade relationship so that we can have a better economic future.
And multilateralism is indeed the global common voice right now. Now let's hear what President Donald Trump has to say in Osaka.
It would be historic if we could do a fair trade deal. We're totally open to it, and I know you're totally open to it. I know all of your representatives. I've been working very hard with my representatives and the representatives of the United States, and I will say that I think this can be a very productive meeting, and I think we can go on to do something that truly will be monumental and great for both countries, and that's what I look forward to doing.
So let's see if the US side will show any more sincerity in the near future. And that's it for this edition of The World Today on CGTN. I'm Pandong in Beijing. Bye for now.